Welcome to episode 39 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Happy snow day.
Yes. Hey, Andrew. It is a snowy one. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode, new ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening. And now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
Just a couple episodes back, we discussed a survey about fear maybe not being the best way to get a cybersecurity training to stick for your employees. Well, it just so happens that study was merely scratching the surface of the relationship between psychology and cybersecurity.
Our guest on this episode, Rebecca McKeown, is an independent chartered psychologist and special advisor to Immersive Labs who specializes in cognitive readiness, which helps people be better prepared to respond in crises of all stripes. She joins us now to discuss its applications and implications in cybersecurity. Rebecca, thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We appreciate it. And really, before we even jump into the subject matter at hand, tell us a little bit about what it is you study and your background in psychology.
Yeah, psychology really was a bit of a midlife crisis career change for me. So I went to university at the great old age of 35 and had a career change into occupational psychology. I did a master's degree at Cranfield University in the UK and ended up staying there for 15 years once I'd graduated. And during that time, most of my research was done within high-risk industries such as aviation and defence and security. And having researched the way that people think and behave, how they make decisions, how they problem solve over the last 15 years has sort of led me to draw a number of conclusions about the way that we can improve our learning in these sort of areas to help people when they're in a crisis situation or a particularly challenging environment that they've never been in before with new problems and that sort of thing. So it's really a culmination of, an awful lot of work.
So in one of your articles, you speak a lot about the idea of cognitive readiness, particular vocab word of the day for us here. Can you give us a quick primer? Exactly what is cognitive readiness?
Yeah, sure. What it is, it's really the development of the skills that underpin things like decision making, understanding the situation and problem solving. And if you develop those skills and enhance them, then what that means is that you are then cognitively ready for any situation that you can encounter. And that's why it's so useful for crisis situations. It's about the complexity of situations that you're dealing with. You can't always rely on previous experience and knowledge to solve those sorts of new problems, particularly when it's under a stressful environment. So it's really about enhancing thinking skills and learning to react differently when you're in a crisis.
And one crisis that has many, many different forms is a cybersecurity crisis. So how does that and how have you in recent times in particular really started to see its applications in cybersecurity training?
Well, it all starts off really with some of the fundamentals of cognitive psychology. In other words, how your brain works. What happens in a crisis situation is that it sets off an alarm in a small part of the brain called the amygdala. And that in turn then sends messages throughout the central nervous system and into the body to produce adrenaline because you think you're under some form of attack. Now, in the olden days, when you were sort of coming out of your cave, foraging for food and getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger, that's quite easy to understand. Rarely that happens these days. So the anxiety and the fear comes in from this crisis situation when it suddenly dawns on you that you're under attack and this is going to have some massive consequences. So what happens is in order for you to focus on the attack, your brain just really, really narrows down onto the thing that's happening there and then and in front of you. And it does that to try and save you, to make sure that you're focusing all your attention on this crisis. However, what it also does, it narrows the way that you think. So we call it cognitive narrowing. I don't know if you've ever been in a car accident or something like that where time almost stands still and you notice nothing but everything that's happening within that accident. And it's a kind of the same thing there. So you understand that there's a certain amount of a fearful situation. Your brain focuses down into dealing with that. But in doing that focusing down, you then lose sight of everything else that you know about dealing with that attack. Basically, you don't really think straight anymore.
In a cybersecurity setting, this could be something like you accidentally click an email and suddenly you've got an alert that perhaps you've been breached. And at that point, you kind of get tunnel vision and you don't take a breath and read what's in front of you, and instead just start clicking buttons or whatever sort of instinctive response you've got.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, you feel the fear and then you just start to react, and that's not really the best way of dealing with it effectively.
Right. And so how do you train cognitive readiness and specifically apply it to something like cybersecurity?
Well, it's kind of difficult. It's not one of these things that you can just go onto a training course and get a certificate at the end of it and you can actually do that with no problem, because what you're doing is you're fighting a natural reaction, an instinctive reaction, so you can't stop it happening. And when it comes to training, what we like to do is to introduce people to the fact that it can happen, because if you recognize when you're in that situation and that you're reacting in a certain way, that recognition alone can be enough just to stop you from that immediate reaction and to start thinking about other different things that you could do. And in order to do that, we have these enhanced thinking skills, and you learn those by learning how you react in lots and lots and lots of different types of scenarios, which is where the Immersive Labs crisis simulator comes in. The more scenarios that you do, you start to spot patterns underlying them. So whilst they might look different on the surface, you might say, hang on a minute. We did this last time, it looks similar, we could try that solution again. So really, you're learning different patterns of behaviour to counteract those biases. So it's a combination of sort of a bit of knowledge and understanding of how your brain works, and then regular practice, and also embedding that practice by doing what the military would call an after-action review. So looking back on it, what happened, what was supposed to happen, what could we have done better, what did we do well at, and how would we adapt in the future? And that constant learning cycle then builds expertise in cognitive readiness skills.
So that's really a little bit of a departure in terms of cybersecurity training from the idea of maybe a once a year tabletop exercise, organization-wide, things like that, where maybe it's just one scenario. How have organizations been able to start shifting their thinking there?
I think it's a difficult thing to shift in thinking, because I think there's a sort of temptation to stick with what we know and with what works. And I don't think that the once a year tabletop involving everybody is necessarily a bad thing. But what you're not going to do is build up the skills of those who are on the front line. And the reason that happens is that there's a thing called skill fade. So once you've learned sort of all these processes and you've learned decision making, those skills degrade really, really quickly. So to keep them at the gold standard, you really need to be training and exercising them once every 2 months as a minimum. So therefore the yearly tabletop exercise is going to hit some of its learning outcomes and aims, but it's certainly not going to develop cognitive readiness.
So there still is some value to these sort of scenario-based simulations, but it's sort of a matter of frequency and really sort of processing through it afterwards, it sounds like.
Yes, it is. Yeah, if that becomes part of the sort of the day job, if you like, if the organisation has the culture that allows you to sort of learn in that type of way by giving some space, a few days after the event to just sit and reflect on what happened, then that is an incredibly powerful learning mechanism, far more than just the once a year or, the big event where everybody takes part.
And you actually mentioned recently about the pandemic sort of being its own, I guess we're all feeling like we're living in a simulation sometimes based on how things have played out over the past year. But one particular feature of the pandemic relating to this idea of shifting away from the tabletop exercises is the difficulty in practically getting everybody together to do something like that anyway. So do you think that this is a situation, the remote world that we're now in, that might help people to make that switch into how they look at training?
Absolutely. I think that certainly for me, one of the benefits of it being is that I don't have to travel anywhere near as much as I used to. And I think that because we had no choice but to adapt very, very quickly, it's kind of shown everybody, yes, we can do this. We don't have to be in an office to actually be able to work effectively. And the same applies to training. I've dealt with a number of companies who've asked to have their training put online because whilst their employees have been on furlough and they can't work, they can at least train. So I think it's the sort of progress that was happening happening anyway, but the pandemic has accelerated it tremendously. So we've now sort of almost leapt into the future by a good 5 years or so. And I think that now everybody's had, well, gosh, almost a year of working online. We all know how Zoom works. We all forget to unmute as soon as we join it. That's a side issue. And all of the different availabilities there. And there are some tremendous tools out there that you can use that encourage engagement during online training. So I used to be a little bit skeptical about training for this sort of thing in anything other than a classroom. But I think that now the technology is there to enable us to do that. And I think also cost-wise, there's a phenomenal benefit to it. If you're not having to drag people in from all over the country, flights, hotel fees, not to mention the time away from the desk, I think that actually in this respect, the pandemic has been really good for us.
And in cybersecurity in particular, I mean, we're talking about people being on their computers anyway, so it seems like a pretty natural fit.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's those of us who are not on our computers all the time anyway have now caught up with the rest of the technical world. So that it's not a bad thing at all.
So while we're on the subject of working from home, I'm sure there's quite a lot of very interesting psychology problems taking place in everybody's head right now with their work-life balance and sort of separating the idea of home, office, and work. So what are some of the different cognitive biases people that are working from home might have that could put them in a danger in a cybersecurity incident?
I think really there's a whole number of things here that are going on. It's the fact that actually you're working from home is a very different environment. You might feel a little bit less formal about things because you're in a very comfortable space. So that can impact on your attitude and your behaviour. The other thing is not so great because it might mean that you have a house full of people. You might be homeschooling 3 children under the age of 12. So therefore, there is an awful lot of pressure there to maintain what you think you should be doing in the day job, as well as looking after the family and the home education thing. And you can't do both of those jobs full time. It's just impossible. So there is, again, that sort of pressure on what we call cognitive workload, the amount of things that you have to think about. So again, you're going to experience cognitive narrowing. It's an anxiety-inducing situation. How do I flick between concentrating and focusing on all of these different things? So that in itself, it's a real test of people's resilience. And I think that training for cognitive readiness helps that because at least you feel better prepared to deal with these things that are being thrown at us.
We're talking about cognitive readiness in a cybersecurity scenario, but this is something that really does have, wide-ranging, far-reaching implications for people if they start thinking this way.
It does. And I think, like I say, it's about being prepared, but it's also about having the confidence to know that if an unusual set of circumstances arises or a crisis comes up, it's about having the confidence to know that you are equipped to deal with those things. So once that initial adrenaline surge when the realization dawns has disappeared, you can then relax a little bit more because you've got so much more experience in pulling all of these sort of things together so you can come up with a really good solution. And I think that also working as teams on cognitive readiness and having those discussions means that there is increased trust amongst the team that you're working with. You're also more likely to ask for help or for support or for an opinion.
Right. Yeah, definitely sort of a team building exercise in general, as well as a training exercise.
Yeah, it's went around to this one when you say it like that, isn't it? There are a lot of benefits to it. I mean, it's not just also about the way that you think. And there is also a relationship building element to it because I think that the way the world is going, people have to operate in a number of spaces, not just the one they're familiar with. Mm-hmm. So it also means that you have to work across multifunctional teams. You can guarantee that those teams will have competing interests and priorities. So there's also another part of cognitive readiness, which is about really understanding how other people think, how to communicate with people who are not in the same group as you.
And that really dovetails into one of the pieces that we mentioned in our introduction here, the recent survey about fear and cybersecurity training in terms of scenarios based on, if you press this button, and we have our organization is breached, then you might get fired, you might get pay docked, your whole world may fall apart, basically. So don't press this button, don't open this email, and things like that. And that study suggested that fear tactic, it maybe works initially on a quick response situation, but long term does not work so well. So what are your thoughts on that fear aspect in cybersecurity and in general training of employees for best practices?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated one because you have got that fear thing that we've talked about this sort of cognitive narrowing and all the rest of it. But you've also sort of got this. There's a huge gap between those in charge of cybersecurity and people like myself who are the end user sitting at home with an annoying request for yet another password change. Like I can't remember the 500 I already have. So I think there's that sort of different views coming here. Is the cybersecurity view is we need to do this to protect ourselves, but the person on the end user side of it doesn't necessarily understand the consequences or the repercussions from that and the importance of it, because to them it's just something that's getting in the way of them doing the day job. So I think it's really quite important to be able to understand the point of view of the other one. From the cyber perspective, you can't blame everything on the user. From the user perspective, it's about having an understanding that there's more to it than you perhaps realise. And I think that's the benefit of trying to bring user groups together to communicate across exactly what's going on. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and he's a CISO for a large organisation, and they'd actually made themselves available for sort of what you call a fireside chat, so people can just ask questions at an informal online meeting. And they've found that by engaging with users that way, there's an increased understanding. So there is therefore a little bit more compliance with the awareness programs that they've been training out.
So talking about the practical side of these things, and I'm going to bring up another vocabulary term for our audience today. And this is something that you talk about in a few different articles that you've written recently, is micro drilling, this sort of new wave of training, particularly suited to the remote world. Could you tell us a little bit about what micro drilling is and what that looks like on the ground?
Yeah, sure. I mean, micro drilling really, as it suggests, it's a small amount of drills. Drills being a military term for operations sort of type thing. So what it is, it's instead of like the big tabletop thing, it's lots of little scenarios. Now you can bring lots of different people in from different areas. It doesn't just have to be the cybersecurity people within the organisation that's training. It's much cheaper because, as we said before, there's a reduction in people having to travel. But with the micro drills, it's this constant process of refreshing those procedural and decision-making skills and talking about them afterwards. So the advantage of doing it in micro drills is that you can take up less time, but on a more regular basis to achieve a far greater effect from the training. We always talk about transfer of training to the workplace, and that is where, generally speaking, a lot of training just sort of disappears into the gap between the training course and then actually using it. But by doing micro drills, it's that constant training, so you're constantly updating those skills, and everybody who's taking part is moving up sort of from being novice through to competent and proficient and then into expert levels of response. So I think for me, it's probably the new way forward. The classroom is great in some situations, but one size doesn't fit all with training as well as many other things.
And as you said, time management wise, if you build that into brief windows during a work day, work week for someone who's at home, maybe it's something they can do, as you said, if they're furloughed or unable to come into the office for another reason. So it does seem suited to our current environment.
Oh, certainly. And I think also that it's an engagement piece, because there is a feeling of sort of being very much on your own when you're stuck working at home, and you don't necessarily have all the colleagues around. You don't have the water cooler chats and that sort of thing. So actually, to create that sort of engagement and encourage conversation does help people to feel less alone and disenfranchised, really, because let's face it, if you've got a bunch of unhappy people at home, less loyalty to the organisation, there's an increase there of insider threat. So I think it's good in many ways. It's about people feeling bonded and belonging to something, and that's really important for us.
So for all of this that we've discussed, if someone's listening right now who owns a business or is in a CISO position or a position where training might be dealt out, how would somebody go about implementing this approach?
It's very much, I think, a case of it can be slotted into the current training regimes that you already have in place. It doesn't have to be a very big, here's a brand new training piece that's going to cost us a huge amount of money. What you can do is to take what you already have and adapt it to include the types of skills that we're talking about, and to include that after action review, because that alone can be quite important. And I think that's the benefit of what Immersive have been working on, is that it doesn't have to be a great big add-on. Let's integrate it into your current ways of working. It's more acceptable for the company, it's more acceptable for the employees, and actually if you're increasing engagement with them in that effect, it's a very positive thing.
Great. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Probably a couple of hours worth, but You have to forgive me. I really do enjoy talking about this. And I've been locked down for far too long.
Well, we appreciate it. Thank you very much for taking the time. Very informative conversation. And again, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you.
And now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at a few top stories in the cybersecurity world and discuss what they may mean to you. So on to headline number 1, the top 25 most phished brands. So I think, Andrew, we have discussed a list something like this maybe last year or so at this time, but I think it's always worth checking in on it. In this case, Inky processed upwards of 657 million emails in 2020, and they ranked the top 25 most phished brands during last year. So quite a few phishing campaigns mixed in there. How many were there?
Right. So they found 4,874,000 phishing campaigns, of which 591,000, so about a fifth or a little less than a fifth of those were impersonating brands. So of this, that accounts for about 40,000, a little more than that, unique campaigns. So a unique campaign being basically one email, which could be sent to different recipients, or it might have some slightly different content, but generally speaking, it's got the same sort of payload and general layout. So about 40,000 unique campaigns total, split over a number of different brands.
And what's interesting is in this top 25 list, there's one that's like far and away above everybody else, and then we get down to a couple in like the next tier, and then it goes down a bit more to tier 3 in terms of the companies that were used.
Yeah, I'm actually very surprised by this list, especially the breakdown of the campaign counts. So number 1, Microsoft, which not a huge surprise, I'd say.
No.
You got different patch notes and all sorts of different Microsoft email and services, and AWS maybe is caught in there. I'm not sure, but or I guess it'd be Azure, not AWS.
Yeah, but yeah, Microsoft has so many fingers in the pool, or I don't know what kind of metaphor that was that I just said, but
everybody has a finger in that pool.
Yeah, but Microsoft has so many different platforms, and obviously a lot of people use their email services, so it could just be messages purporting to be from the email provider too. So out of those 40 plus thousand, 28,500 were Microsoft. So that's about 70% of those brand impersonations. And then, so that's the far and away leader. The rest of them combined, just doing some back of the napkin math, I think that's around 30% that's left after that.
Right. And then in the number 2 slot, you kind of see the impact of the pandemic over the last year, with Zoom being the number 2 at about 10%, or about just short of 4,000 count. So I think that makes sense. You get a lot of Zoom invitations going back and forth in 2020.
Yeah. And again, as you said, I bet if we dug up the previous year's list that Zoom would barely register on there, or at least would not be number 2 on the list.
2020 is the year of Zoom, I suppose.
Oh yeah, definitely. And so number 3 is another one that I think this is probably where you were saying you were a little bit surprised at some of the levels. So Amazon being number 3 out of this top 25 is not a surprise, but it is a surprise that it's, so far below Microsoft and then below Zoom, with about 6.7% of the brand impersonations, or 2,700, because I know personally it feels like I get a lot of Amazon phishing emails that come through.
Yeah, a lot of packages out there, a lot of tracking numbers, things like that. I would assume a lot of people would likely click if they got a notification from Amazon, because that's, something you spent your money on and something on the way, exciting mail on the way. You want to know more. So
yeah.
Number 4 was Chase Bank, which it kind of surprised me also that this is really the only large bank I see on here. You got American Express a little farther down, but as far as financial banks are concerned, Chase is the representative.
Yeah, so you got Chase with now we've dropped down to that 3rd tier, because we had Zoom and Amazon combined for about 15 or 16%, and now that leaves about 14% for the rest of the top 25, and Chase had 2.3%, followed up by Ring Central, which is, if you don't use Zoom, then maybe you use Ring Central for the same thing. That's about 2% on the list. And, a lot of this top 25, it's almost kind of evenly split between sort of business applications and personal applications.
Yeah, sort of that consumer side. CVS is on the list and looks to be about the number 8 or 9 slot, which I imagine has a lot to do with vaccination and testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then you have like fax services, DocuSign, things of that nature, and LinkedIn. And then, of course, a lot of other retail stuff. So Apple, Walmart, Sam's, and even streaming with Netflix on there. And I have seen some Netflix campaigns come through as well. So yeah, I think none of these is in itself super surprising. But again, it is interesting the scale where you have Microsoft so far out in front of everyone else in terms of use for this.
And as you said, this is something we've touched on in some form years ago. And it's sort of interesting to see how the last years and the events of the last year have sort of had an impact that you can actually see in the numbers as attackers change their strategies.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the vaccine situation with CVS. That's something that we've talked about in a number of episodes over the past several months with cyber attacks relating to the vaccine, not only in phishing emails, but actual like supply chain type attacks. But CVS is the only one that shows up here. But this is from last year, and you wonder if that'll even ramp up more, and more other similarly situated places might show up like CVS in the next couple of months as vaccines become very widely available.
Right, and everybody starts to schedule and double check their scheduled time and so forth. Yeah, I could imagine those would have more representation in the next year's list, and I'm sure we'll cover that in a year's time.
Yeah, so it's a good snapshot to keep kind of popping in and see where things stand, and it's also good for awareness if you are a little suspicious of certain emails coming in. Now you know what the hackers seem to like using the most. So if you have an overload of Microsoft emails in your inbox, then treat them with a little bit of added skepticism.
Indeed.
On to headline number 2, hybrid older users most targeted by Gmail attackers. So we just talked about phishing emails and our top 25 phishing companies being used in phishing emails. This one is talking about more who is getting targeted. So researchers at Google and Stanford analyzed 1.2 billion malicious emails. So that's an even bigger chunk of analysis to find out what makes users likely to get attacked. And they start this particular piece by mentioning that two-factor authentication was actually not that big of a factor.
Yeah, so two-factor authentication we've talked about quite a bit on this show. That seems to be the default now coming into play for a lot of these different platforms. I know a few platforms recently have made it so that it's required, or they're basically not going to let you use their service. But this particular survey found that whether or not somebody had two-factor authentication set up on their account actually only made a nominal difference as to whether they were attacked or not. Surprisingly, the people that had set up a recovery mechanism did face higher odds. So if you've got your cell phone as your password recovery set up on Facebook, suddenly you might be at a higher risk of receiving a phishing email.
Yeah, that was a little bit of a strange bit based on sort of conventional knowledge. But so the researchers looked at these 1.2 billion emails that were automatically blocked by Gmail over a 5-month period. And, I think what was a little bit odd here in terms of users whose personal details have been exposed by a third-party breach. That one makes sense in terms of who has the highest risk of being targeted. But the second one on the list was the one that kind of jumped out at me in a strange manner.
Yeah. If you are in the country of Australia, have a very high risk of receiving a phishing email. So the United States obviously makes up the highest overall volume, but on a per capita basis, they found the higher risk areas are actually in Europe and Africa, with the number 1 per capita risk belonging to users in Australia.
Yeah, so did not have that one on the radar before, but that's interesting. But
turns the worldview upside down.
And then other ones on the list of higher risk are older users, people who may not be quite as savvy with the internet and the continued evolution of of threats that are out there. And then those who use both desktops and mobile devices, which is a lot of people who work at least. And also, again, maybe a lot of elderly folks as well in their leisure use. I know some prefer to hop onto that computer to do their leisurely web browsing rather than the mobile device, but they may still have to pop on there from time to time.
Right. And there's a multitude of different factors that sort of play into why this is the case. It could be socioeconomic factors, whereas if you have only a desktop or only mobile, maybe you are less likely to then be signed up for additional internet services and kind of reducing your online footprint. Mm-hmm. You also have the idea that if people are used to working on a mobile and a desktop situation, that maybe they're a little more lax with their cybersecurity as they jump from one to the other and start to blend that personal and business world. So a few different factors involved with why this might be the case.
Yeah, so the report modeled the likelihood of receiving any phishing or malware emails in a given week as a function of geographic location, demographics, security posture, device access, and prior security incidents. And, I didn't mean to gloss over the first one, but that is the biggest one. Users whose personal details have been exposed by a third-party breach. And as you said, the more exposure you have, it certainly would suggest that the more chance you have of getting those details exposed. So, right. And that could be just your email address, your phone number, sometimes more than that, it could be passwords and things of that nature as well.
Yeah, and if you've been breached in the past, then very likely all that information sitting on the dark web being sold in big batches to other attackers for future uses. So if you've been attacked once, you'll be attacked twice. Lightning definitely strikes twice in the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of a break in between, but that personal info is out there and it's not going away, so it'll come back again.
Right. So if you're an older user in Australia and you've been breached before, you are very, very high risk.
Yeah. So again, you just want to keep an eye on your risk and try to mitigate as many of these factors as you can. The Gmail report actually says in Australia, for instance, they face twice the odds of being targeted versus Americans. So again, I'm not sure exactly why that is. I don't know if they even know why that is in this report, but going with some other odds situations, the odds of someone 55 to 64 age group experience an attack is on average 1.64 times that of an 18 to 24-year-old. You also wonder, again, obviously the older you are, the more you may be out there online in the first place in terms of exposure, but also maybe in terms of the type of exposure that phishing and malware type emails are looking for.
Right. If you've been using the internet pretty steadily for the last 20 years, you've probably signed up for quite a few things as compared to someone that just turned 18 and is a new baby on the internet.
Yeah, and you're doing your online banking and credit cards and lots of maybe higher value purchases and things of that nature. So yeah, you could see that exposure situation being there. But yeah, again, interesting snapshot. It's kind of another snapshot from a little bit different angle. But again, the inbox is where dangers lurk one way or the other. Now, headline number 3. Military nuclear entities under target by novel Android malware. And there was a comma in there, so I should say military nuclear entities under target by novel Android malware. The two malware families that are being involved in this situation, this is targeting these types of facilities in Pakistan and Kashmir. And the two families are called Hornbill and Sunbird.
Right. So researchers have found these malware families are linked with fairly high confidence to an advanced persistent threat group known as Confucius. This Confucius group is state-sponsored pro-India actor, and they've previously targeted quite a few victims in Pakistan and South Asia. For those of you unaware of the geopolitical situation in that area of Kashmir, it's not great.
Right. Yeah. And it hasn't been great for some time. So now we've just moved into using cyber attacks as another option here for that particular situation. Again, going back to looking back at previous episodes, we did a story maybe around a year ago again of a nuclear facility, I believe, a nuclear power plant in India being targeted by some threat actors out there. So I don't know if this is like turnabout as fair play or something.
Is this an evolving story or?
Yeah, I don't know.
So these two malware strains that you mentioned, Sunbird and Hornbill, are largely surveillance-based type malware, and these are specifically targeting the Android operating system. So the idea here being that this malware was installed through apps. It does not appear that any of these downloaded apps were available in the Google Play Store, but one way or another, once these apps were on their target's devices, they were able to extract information like call logs, metadata, as well as even pulling WhatsApp data. So notifications, messages, and voice notes, which, for WhatsApp, sporting themselves as a high security sort of anonymous service. It's quite a big change.
Yeah, they've had troubles lately with their reputation anyways. So they're actually referring to it in this article as surveillanceware. So that's another new mashup of words that I hadn't heard before. But surveillance can certainly lead to further problems. We know just with the SolarWinds hack that a lot of activity there seemed to be surveillance based, but it's likely that any type of surveillance process is probably trying to get at some things that are a little more serious than just sitting back and seeing what people are doing.
Yeah, I'm sure they're not just interested in what they're talking about on WhatsApp. This is very likely one piece of a much larger operation. So this specific malware was targeting people in positions at the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission, as well as numerous contacts at the Pakistani Air Force. This same malware was also used to spy on officers for the electoral rolls in the Kashmir region. So nuclear facilities, military facilities, election facilities, these are some pretty big targets.
Yeah, and actually individuals in at least 14 different countries were targeted. At least 156 victims identified in a single campaign for Sunbird back in 2019. There is a little bit of an element beyond just surveillanceware, though, for Sunbird, as that does feature remote access Trojan functionality so that commands can be executed on an infected device as directed by an attacker. So Hornbill is pretty much just surveillance, whereas Sunbird may be a little bit more serious.
Right, and there wasn't any indication one way or the other if those remote access sort of threat tools had been used, but they certainly were capable of doing so. So Sunbird itself was probably downloaded while it was disguising itself as a different number of security services, one of which being Google Security Framework, or applications that are specific to activities. So the examples they provided were apps called Mania Soccer and Falconry Connect. So interesting app that I'll have to check out later. Maybe not that exact one, but I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, so the falconing community definitely under attack here by this particular, and really we're very bird-based. So it's falconry apps that are being used, and Sunbird and Hornbill, lots of birds in this story.
Yeah, it's a little suspicious. No, actually, the name for these two malwares that we're coming up with were created by the group that discovered them. They were named after a pair of actual birds native to the India area. So that is the Indian gray hornbill, as well as the Sunbird. Actually, that one's named after the malware Sun Service, which is part of the overall malware. But I guess they just, to keep consistent, they threw the word bird in there.
They got to stay on brand, right?
Right. Yeah. You got Sun Service. There's the Sunbird. That's a thing. Let's just tie it all together.
But yeah, going back to the overall implications of this particular type of attack. I mean, again, when you're dealing with nuclear facilities, military, things of that nature, sort of all bets are off if somebody is trying to get in there, and if they're able to get access to things like that, all sorts of really bad things can happen if the wrong people have access to those types of facilities and those types of, potential weapons or orders or things like that.
Right. We're starting to see a lot of these over the last years of these large state-sponsored attacks, and I'm sure we'll continue to see more throughout 2021. So sort of new era of warfare, if you will. A lot of it involves the cybersecurity space.
Right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, and thanks very much to Rebecca McKeown for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to
get secure, stay secure.